Now the cerebellum, where is it and what is its function? Here we have a sagittal view of our brain. Now here we have the cerebrum. People sometimes get confused between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. The cerebellum is located below the cerebrum, below the occipital lobe. The cerebellum is also known as the little brain and is located in the dorsal aspect of the pons, behind the pons. Roughly in between the cerebellum and the pons, we have what's called the fourth ventricle. The ventricles within the brain is important for the brain because it contains cerebrospinal fluid. Cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF, its main role in the brain is to provide nutrition for the different structures in the brain. And if here's the fourth ventricle, an important, interesting thing to note is the third ventricle is situated here, near the thalamus. Now, the cerebellum, its main role in our body is to coordinate skeletal muscle contraction so that it's precise, so that we don't fall down. So it basically helps us coordinate our movements. So let's have a closer look at the cerebellum and have a closer look at the anatomy. So here we have the brainstem, well, part of the brainstem. Here we have the pons and here we have the cerebellum, dorsal of the pons. The cerebellum consists of anterior lobes and posterior lobes. It also consists of this tree-like structure which is composed of white matter known as the arbor vitae, A as in plural. So now, a very important thing to know is that the cerebellum connects to the pons, the midbrain, and the medulla oblongata through the cerebellar pendicles. I hope I pronounced that right, cerebellar pendicles. And there are three cerebellar pendicles which connects the cerebellum essentially to the brainstem. And these three are the superior pedicle, the middle pedicle, and the inferior pedicle. So they connect, again, the cerebellum to the brainstem. And they are important because they also send in and send out signals from the cerebellum. Another final thing to note is that cerebellum consists of two hemispheres. The cerebrum, the main part of the brain, you can say, also consists of two hemispheres. And so from this, we can deduce that the cerebellum also has two hemispheres. But through this diagram, we can't really tell. So let's look at it from a different diagram, from the bottom, from a bottom view, let's just say. So here we have another image diagram of the cerebellum. Cerebellum here, as you can see, consists of two hemispheres. And here we have the brainstem coming down. What separates the two hemispheres, or what joins them together, is an area known as the vermis. And here we have the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe of the cerebellum. And this red line I'm drawing, as you can see, shows that the cerebellum consists of two hemispheres. Now let's stop there and go back to the cerebellar pendicles. Those three pendicles that are important in connecting the cerebellum to the brainstem. And they're important because it allows signals to be sent in and out of the cerebellum. So now, here is a diagram of only the brainstem with the thalamus on the top. Now this brainstem consists of the midbrain here, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. And we're only concentrating on this area here, which is the cerebellar pendicles, part of it, which connects the cerebellum to the brainstem. Of course, in this diagram, I did not draw the cerebellum because we're only concentrating on these fibers. And remember that we have three cerebellar peduncles, or peduncles, probably properly called. Peduncle, which connects the cerebellum to the midbrain, and it also provides feedback signals to the cerebrum. So the superior peduncle provides signals from the cerebellum to the cerebrum. Next, we have the middle peduncle, which conveys impulses of voluntary movements from the cerebrum through the pons and to the cerebellum. So the middle peduncle's role essentially is in giving signals from the cerebrum, the main part of the brain, to the cerebellum. So it's the opposite of the superior peduncle. The superior peduncle conveys impulses from the cerebellum to the cerebrum. The middle peduncle conveys impulses from the cerebrum to the cerebellum. So opposite. And finally, we have the inferior peduncle, which connects the cerebellum to the medulla oblongata and the spinal cord. And it contains both incoming vestibular and proprioceptive fibers and outgoing motor fibers. What the inferior peduncle essentially does is that it receives information from our limbs, you can say, from our joints, from our muscles, and interprets this. And then also sends out signals for coordinated movements together with the cerebrum. I hope that all makes sense. You have to understand, it's not the cerebellum that sends out the motor signals, it's the cerebrum which actually sends out the motor signals, but it's the cerebellum which assists in coordination and interpreting the best possible way to send out the motor signal being sent out by the cerebrum, if that makes sense. Okay, let's just look at an overall picture first, so we can get a better understanding of the role the cerebellum has in the human body, because it has a very big role. So if here is our cerebral cortex, the one that's actually going to send the motor signals, it will send the signal to the brainstem and the spinal cord, or the spinal cord. And from the brainstem, it will pass on to the spinal cord, and then it will go to the limbs or different parts of our body for a movement. I wrote here coordinated movements because the final product, the final output is a coordinated movement. But a coordinated movement cannot happen without the assistance of the cerebellum. So before the cerebral cortex can actually send out a coordinated movement, the spinal cord will send signals to the brainstem or to the cerebellum straight away, which will tell the cerebellum the position of the muscle and the joints of different limbs, for example. So with this information, the cerebellum can create a blueprint of the best possible way that the cerebral cortex can initiate a very good movement. So the cerebellum will calculate and interpret the signals coming from the muscle and from the limbs and send a blueprint to the cerebral cortex. It will send it first to the thalamus, and from the thalamus the blueprint will go to the cerebral cortex. And with this blueprint, the cerebral cortex can then send out a coordinated movement, or send out signals to the brainstem and the spinal cord to initiate a coordinated movement. The cerebellum itself will also send a signal to the brainstem, to the spinal cord, to help in this coordination process. So it's fundamental to know that a coordinated movement requires a cerebellum. I hope that makes a bit of sense. Now let's look at a diagram picture of this overall process, you can say. So here we have a sagittal view of the brain again. So here we have the thalamus, and it's a relay, and it contains relay nucleuses from the motor cortex to the brainstem. We have the motor cortex here in this part of the cerebral cortex, and we have the somatosensory cortex. The pons situated here, and the medulla oblongata. Another important nuclei to know within the medulla oblongata is the accessory cuneate nucleus, and we'll soon see its role. Now with this diagram, let's see an overall picture of how the motor cortex, or how we will initiate a motor movement, such as moving our hands or moving our legs when we walk. First of all, notice the middle peduncle's role, in that it conveys impulses of voluntary movements from the cerebrum through the pons and to the cerebellum. So notice that first, and we'll use that in our first explanation. So what happens first is that the motor cortex will send signals via the relay nuclei in the thalamus to the cerebellum to notify the cerebellum of its intent to initiate movement. Movement in the biceps, for example. And it sends these signals through the middle peduncle. And at the same time, the cerebellum actually receives signals from many different limbs continuously. For example, it receives signals from proprioceptors in the biceps and in the joints of the biceps to notify the cerebellum of its position. So these signals from the proprioceptors will travel via the accessory cuneate nucleus into the cerebellum, and it enters the cerebellum through the inferior peduncle. And so with this information from the motor cortex and from the proprioceptors, the cerebellum can then calculate the best option to coordinate muscle contraction, and it also required. And then after calculating the best option, the cerebellum will send this blueprint to the motor cortex. It will first send it out of the cerebellum through the superior peduncle, and then through the thalamus into the motor cortex. And then with this, the motor cortex can then send out a signal down the pons, down the brainstem, to the spinal cord, to send out a coordinated movement to the biceps in this case, to move the arms. I hope that all makes sense, and I hope you can appreciate the role the cerebellum has in our body, in that it provides balance, coordination of our voluntary movements. And by the way, this is just an overall picture. It definitely goes into more difficulty if you look more deeper into this nerves and fibers and stuff. Hope you enjoyed it though. Thanks for watching.